Right, it's live. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sourabhi Dutta, and I welcome you all to the discussion series on working women in history, curated under TMYS Review June 2025, which is the first of the four projects themed on four distinct lenses to observe and understand the personal and social spheres of working women. We are calling for submissions of essays, poems, and short stories under the project. To know more about our submission guidelines and project architecture, please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz. The topic for today is Innocence to Radicalism, Women Who Resorted to Violence. I consider myself extremely privileged to be in the company of our esteemed panelists, Professor Jyoti Atwal, Professor Sharmila Paul, and Ms. Richa Lakhera, who will shortly share their insights with us. Without further ado, then, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker for the session is Professor Jyoti Atwal. Dr. Atwal is an associate professor of modern Indian history at the Center for Historical Studies, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India, and visiting professor at UCD School of History, University College, Dublin, Ireland. She was also adjunct professor at University of Limerick 2017 to 2022. She specializes in modern Indian history with a focus on gender and socio-political history. Her area of interest includes Irish history with a focus on transnational anti-imperial movements and gender. She has published on themes ranging from the transnational movements and world wars to widowhood, child marriage, gender based violence, caste, and cinema. In 2021, she co edited a book on India, Ireland, and anti imperial struggle, remembering the Connaught Rangers Mutiny, 1920, supported by Embassy of Ireland, New Delhi. She also co edited a volume on gender and violence in historical and contemporary perspectives, situating India, and a co edited volume on gender and history, Ireland, 1852 to 1922. She is also the author of Real and Imagined Widows Gender Relations in Colonial North India. She has held several international fellowships in Ireland, UK, USA, and in other parts of Europe. She has been a recipient of a teaching cum research grant from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Government of Ireland, and has acted as script supervisor in a documentary produced by the DFA. She serves as on the advisory board of several projects at University College Cork, University College Dublin, and in the UK and USA. She has delivered several lectures internationally and has been on TV and radio programs in the UK, Germany, France, Ireland, America, and Australia. We are delighted to have you with us today, ma'am. Uh, Thank you for joining us. Our second panelist for the session is Professor Sharmila Paul. Dr. Paul is presently teaching as an assistant professor at the Department of English, Rani Billa Girls College, affiliated to the University of Calcutta. She has been awarded her doctoral degree by the Department of English, University of Kalyani, India, on translation studies in 2019. Her areas of interest are translation studies, feminist and gender studies, post-colonial studies, partition literature, film narratives, culinary studies, memory and trauma studies. We are delighted to have you with us today, ma'am. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our next speaker for the evening is Miss Richa Lakhera. Miss Lakhera is a screenwriter, author, and former deputy editor at NDTV. She is well known for her contribution to popular fiction writing. Her career as an author started with her debut novel, Garbage Beat, published by HarperCollins India, followed by crime thrillers Hungry Gods and Item Girl and Contamination. Her latest novel, History of Violence, is slated to be released in 2025. She's presently working as a screenwriter in several Bollywood films and OTT series. We are delighted to have you for the panel, ma'am. Thank you for joining us. Right, so we'll now open the forum for discussion. I would like to request Professor Atwal first to share her insights. Over to you, ma'am.
Hello, very good evening to all of you. Am I audible? Am I
Sure,
clearly
sure.
audible?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, thanks very much, Sourabhi, and hello to other panelists. I'm also very grateful to Coral Das Gupta for having me, for thinking of me, and for giving me opportunity to share my thoughts, share my views, which are mostly, they're confined to the academic audience. But I always get an opportunity to speak to the other kind of audience when I'm on Facebook, on our website. So, yes, I think it's such an interesting subject that we're discussing today. Innocence to radicalism. First of all, I think both the ideas that there is innocence and that there is radicalism are a construct. And I think we are looking at mostly the constructs that we, in society. Innocence, there is no complete innocence. Women and men both are not. Innocence in itself is a construct, therefore it's not about men and women. But when we look at women, it's the idea of morality, chastity that takes over this whole idea of innocence. That is very central to the idea that they would not be able, they're unaware, and they're secluded from that kind of transgression, and that at no point should in their households or as life as housewives or girls should they be ever introduced to any subversive ideas. But radicalism also at the same time, there is, transcending, whether personally, politically, or in different spaces. We have, I think, we look at these categories as open to discussion. That's the first thing I want to put forth. The other is that, when we look at the idea of innocence and radicalism, it was first. I would open up with the book by Betty Friedan on the feminine mystique, where she points out to the unhappy wives. Now, who are these women who are unhappy? So there are these unhappy women who have potential for radicalism. So she was in a way looking at this as a potential crowd for radicalism. So this is, I think, as long as we look at the women as a category, not only as a biological category, but as a category which we understand as a construct. So women started looking at themselves after the writings of Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, and all those series of works that have come up on how the 40s, 50s, 60s gradually opened us up to the idea that womanhood itself is a construct. And therefore, radicalism and innocence, when we look at that, it is a very historical process as to how there was always a desire that one would have an innocent, that women would be innocent and not radical. So, first of all, that is the thing. The other is the third quick point I want to make is that there was the fact that radicalism in women is, and women themselves are construct. We have to look at them not as biological beings, but as women with agency. And where is the power located between individuals and the system? That's how their resistance and their counter public is dependent on those things, their ability to negotiate between different kinds of social networks. And for that, what I mean by that is, for example, I'm going to give you an example of the best woman who can be quoted as an example of violence, yet a woman who cannot ignore. This is the very bandit queen. We know the Fulan Devi. The movie was produced in 1996, and it was not a story about a woman who's independent victim, or it was not a woman who's but she became a woman open to discussion. But the way, as you know, we all of us know that there was a certain discomfort, high level of discomfort, which Fulan Devi held with the movie. And she actually did file a police case against Shekhar Kapoor, where she said that, this was like inflicting another kind of injury on her, and to see herself, and many of those the nude scenes, etc., were not really would hurt her. So but it was not a question of morality, it was how the resistance was to be understood. How do we understand resistance in this case? Is it an individual? So Shekhar Kapoor brought it out as a very painful story of an individual woman. I think it was not an individual. I think it was a woman who needs to be uh, understood as part of a social system, which is caste in this place. Caste and class become two operative factors, and this is where we use the idea of construct. This is where we use the idea of feminine mystique as to what is this woman, how can you unravel and understand this woman, and not reduce this particular case to a personalized case of violence. Of course, we know that I'll just take a few more minutes. Sourabhi, would you remind me when to stop? Because just I think I've got 5 more minutes. If I was speak for 10 minutes.
Sure, ma'am. Okay.
Yeah, I just wound up with 2 3 more points. And so historically, when I looked at some of the women who showed the signs of transgression, it was mostly in the colonial period. And the worry about that was that women were, it came with the study of widows. And that was my principal work, initial work, where I looked at certain cases. And in these cases, women were being women who were denied property were again and again be dragged into the court. Unfortunately, we do not know the economic status of these women, except a few. We know from their past, their saints or their uh, traders, etc. But in many of the cases, the reason to deny property was that she was unchaste, and that became the only reason to deny her the property rights or any share rights. Right was a big word, it was not even recognized. It was the share of maintenance which was denied, and it was as early 1933 that this was under discussion. And we know one case where Keri Kolitani, the Calcutta High Court, she in 1880s, she's the first woman who actually remarried and actually got the right to remarry and also inherited the property of her dead husband, despite the fact that she had remarried, because remarriage was again a subversion and it was looked up down upon as a case of unchastity. So, of course, we know there are cases which continue, and during the historical colonial period, we also have a very important act, the Immoral Traffic Act, and that is something really interesting because it focuses on, as is the title, immoral act. It was later uh, turned into 1950s. It was called Immoral Traffic Act, and this would mean that the idea was initially to actually make prostitutes invisible or to drive them out of the city, in various big cities where the population had expanded, to make these so that the society could be uh, kept clean. So, as we know, many of these women, there was a lot of violence on them. And when we look at this, the part of the women who were killed, who were either killed, murdered inside the quotas or the brothel homes in the early 20th century, part of that was inflicted by women themselves, and they are part of the quota. So some interesting case. One, in fact, in Bombay, Duncan Road case, and this was Akutai, and I mention her in my book. And I think this is interesting because you have to understand what is the nature of violence and who is the perpetrator. Just because women are the perpetrators does not mean they are party to the crime in a similar way, because you cannot take the context in which this crime happened. The quota owner was a man, and the other women were trained to behave in a violent way with co residents. And so that was one thing I've discovered. I've elaborated this in my book, Gender and Violence. Then, of course, lastly, I think Mathura rape case of 1972 was a very landmark. Is a great landmark in this case, where custodial rape happened, presuming the woman is habitual of sex, and this is a tribal woman. So we cannot take a woman out of her context to understand, because there is so much of incrimination of women when they belong to certain castes. With this, I'd like to stop here and also have your views on these cases, possible if you're discussing or from another perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Those were some really enriching observations. I'd like to move on to Professor Paul now. Over to you, ma'am. Please share your insights.
Yeah, so I would be actually expanding upon what Jyoti ma'am has already explained. So my focus, my thrust area would be primarily literature. And as you know that literature and storytelling, they have always been a mirror to societal structures, reflecting how gender, morality, and power are understood and maintained. So, women in these narratives have often been confined to rigid innocence as the epitome of virtue and rebellion as the embodiment of defiance. So, these archetypes mirror cultural and societal biases, positioning women as either passive paragons of morality or dangerous disruptors of order. However, such portrayals often erase the complexities of women's lived realities, particularly their agency and the systemic forces shaping their actions. These archetypes are not confined to fiction, but manifest in real world perceptions of women. For instance, historical figures like Joan of Arc and Malala Yousafzai, they have been celebrated for their courage, also scrutinized for stepping outside traditional gender roles. Joan of Arc, to explain a bit further, she is a young woman who led military campaigns. She was canonized for her virtue, yet she was condemned and executed for her rebellion against gender and societal norms. Similarly, we all know the case of Malala Yousafzai. Her activism for girls' education in the face of the Taliban operation has been heralded globally. But her defiance against patriarchal systems has also provoked backlash. And this illustrates the tension between innocence and rebellion in public perception of women. So, intersectionality sheds light on how race, class, and culture intersect with gender, shaping the experiences of marginalized women. A stark example is Fulan Devi, whom Jyoti ma'am has already referred to. She's also known as the Bandit Queen of India, whose life straddled both archetypes. She was born into poverty and subjected to repeated violence. Then she became an outlaw, resisting systemic oppression through acts of rebellion. And her story, which is often sensationalized, has been reframed through her autobiography and adaptation. Jyoti ma'am has also mentioned the film which was made by Shekhar Kapoor. So, this offers a lens into how caste, gender, and economic exploitation shaped her life and choices. One of the major points that I would like to incorporate here is the role which is played by translation. Now, as we know that translation plays a pivotal role in amplifying such narratives. Gayatri Chakraborty's work highlights the political nature of translation, emphasizing the need to preserve the cultural and political nuances of marginalized voices. And we all know how she has worked in collaboration with Mahashita Devi, who has been the harbinger, who has been looked upon as the voice of these marginalized women, especially the tribal women, downtrodden women. So here also we can give example through the oral histories of Dalit women, most importantly in India. These Dalit women, they have resisted caste through direct and indirect acts of defiance. They have been translated and anthologized. And these translations, this anthologization, they challenge the dominant narratives that often erase their agency. Similarly, indigenous women from the Americas, like Rigobata Manchu, they have used storytelling and translation to share their resistance against colonial and patriarchal oppression. And these reframe their actions as acts of survival and justice. So, most importantly, the gendered perception of violence further highlights the disparity in how society judges women's actions. Take the case of Queen Nzigma of Nongdo and Mataba, an African ruler who resisted Portuguese colonization in the 17th century. While her military strategies and alliances are celebrated as heroic in some accounts, there are others that frame her actions through a lens of moral judgment. And these contrast sharply with the normalized violence of the male rulers. In modern contexts, women like Angela Davis have faced similar scrutiny. Her activism and alleged connections to armed resistance during the civil rights in the United States were framed as radical, and not only radical but also dangerous. And they have even been advocated, they have been talked a lot about because she advocated for systemic justice. So we can say that contemporary storytelling offers an avenue to challenge these reductive archetypes and explore the structural forces driving women's actions. Works like Beloved by Toni Morrison and The Color Purple by Alice Walker, they illuminate the violence and resistance of women who are shaped by systemic operations. And narratives like these, they draw empathy for their actions rather than judgment. So these stories parallel some real life accounts of women like Rosa Parks, whose refusal to give up her seat on a segregated bus was a quiet yet profound act of rebellion. And these rebellions are against systemic injustice. Um, Park's story often simplified into a narrative of passive resistance rooted in deliberate defiance. And this was shaped by years of activism. So, stories of women like Sheetin Beloved, who commits infanticide to protect her child from slavery, parallel historical accounts of enslaved women in the Americas. And these women, they made possible choices to resist dehumanization. Similarly, we can also talk about the portrayal of women freedom fighters in anti colonial struggles, such as Algeria's Sharmila Botard's reframes act of violence as resistance against systemic exploitation. Now, Buhat's role in the Algerian War of Independence that involved planning and executing bombings against French colonial forces. And these actions were then later on demonized by colonial narratives, but they were also celebrated as heroic by her own people. So, by connecting these archetypes in literature to real life examples, we can say that societal biases shape perceptions of women's actions to a great extent. And these actions are determined irrespective of being it a reality or a fiction. So these stories demonstrate that women's resistance, whether through direct violence or systemic defiance or quiet resilience, they deserve to be understood in the context of their lived realities, lived experiences, and the structures that shape them. And by doing so, storytelling, translation, the tools like these, they become transformative tools. So they, by doing so, offer empathy and add nuance, while at the same time they challenge reductive narratives that confine women to innocence or rebellion. So that's it from my side.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insightful observations. Moving on to Miss Lakhera. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Sourabhi, and lovely to hear from Tanushree and Jyoti. And thank you, Coral, for inviting me here. We all feel very strongly about this topic, innocence to radicalism, women who resorted to violence. Having said that, as a journalist, one is exposed to conflict stories more than one would want, you know. I will not talk about Hullan Devi here, who is actually literally the poster girl of this topic, innocence to radicalism, because both the speakers have really spoken about her. But you know, her life, in a way, completely represents this topic. I'll be a little more specific. My books, History of Violence, and my other book, Contamination, both have female protagonists and rebels who do resort to violence. And so, you know, these are stories which are a set and backdrop of conflicts between state and tribal. And just to give a little background, tribes, of course, we see in certain belts like in Northeast or Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Orissa, to name a few. And these tribes are not rich farmers, or you know, they have very little agriculture produce. They live below poverty line, but they have a very distinct culture. They are steeped in rituals. But for them, land is sacred. It's not like the way we look at land in the cities. You know, for us it is real estate, but for them it is an extension of their own selves. So a very unsettling dynamic is always there in the air. So there are a lot of multiple threat factors in the form of whether it is urban sprawls or whether they are exploited by money lenders or zamindars, and you know, also they are largely unaware of their rights, because even education is not in their language, and parents would rather have their kids working in the field. And so not just land wars, uh, their very way of life is threatened. So to be very specific, these tribes live buried under compromises, and they are exploited and stigmatized, marginalized. And fortunately or unfortunately, they become a very perfect background, you know, for rebels to operate and resort to violence, whether it is male or female. So these are proud races, you know, and there's a constant conflict situation faced by both males and females. Uh, Many resist, they choose violence and become rebels, and they join the militia. So when the situation is so bad, sometimes the gender dynamic goes out of the window. Uh, Primal urge to rebel against atrocities is not really very different, whether it is a man or a woman. A primal motive same rehte hain. So of course, the form in which a male or a female rebel may sort of choose to act, the way she will or he will choose to resort to violence may or may not. I mean, the way they react to any kind of atrocity, you know, that may be different. Having said that, this is the backdrop in which my female protagonists are forced to choose violence. They fight back, they earn the wrath of the state. So there's always this conflict between the state and the rebels, female rebels, who are kind of part of the militia. And but the state is powerful, and they have endless supplies. They can outflank any outburst of rebellion. So they use different tools, Dakabandi ho gaya, police bandobast, etc. And stakes just keep getting higher. So there is a constant conflict situation. These wars are not simple. Whether it is covert or active war, there is nothing actually called a low cost war. Even a low intensity war is very complicated, and wars are exhausting, devastating, both for men and women. So I'm particularly, of course, going to talk about the women rebels who join the militia gangs, and they engage in active guerrilla warfare. So there's this whole flag of under the flag of, you know, settlers or indigenous dwellers versus outsiders. So there's just too many separate tragedies, and their stories matter. They have different perspectives. But these conflicts, you know, which are seeded, they never end. They somehow keep mutating. They keep changing form. So, and I'm talking about actual combat. Whether it is, and I'm talking about actual combat. It's not just because we have a female rebel, so we have, you know, that really, I mean, factor is not important. I'm talking about all forms of quasi-military operations. So bullets fly, grenades explode, you have the body count rising, and you have your rebels, females spending, you know, dodging artillery, getting slammed, surviving on low ammunition, and there is this whole dwindling supplies and real possibility of them, you know, starving and freezing to death or getting blown to bits by stray artillery, etc. The violence they are subjected to, actual violence. And the violence they're capable of. So again, here gender is not really very relevant here. But militia rebels fiction, I feel, because I am a popular fiction writer, and that is a kind of content also which I'm working for in the OTT series which I'm working on, and also in the films. So the militia rebels fiction is actually a very underutilized genre, I think, in India. And there is a lot, especially fiction writing, and there's a lot of unexplored terrain, of course, to be covered here. I had to do a lot of research into the nitty gritty of the actual militia combat which happens. How do these female guerrillas? How do they actually work? There is this whole hierarchy which is there. What uniform they wear? What is the language which is used? What is the ammunition which is used? The terrain, which is very rugged. It is not, and where are these wars fought, the conflicts, where do they happen? Then there is a whole emotional aspect of it. There is a trauma of living in a constant war situation. So I also feel that journalism and kind of gives you that resilience. Also, kind of you get more resources to kind of see through these kind of stories. For instance, I'll give you an example. For instance, if there's a conflict situation, actual combat happening, is it a low or high intensity combat? What kind of weapon is used? What MO is used? Where do they make it? Obviously they won't have that much money, so these are probably made in. Their weapons are cheap and functional. They are second hand. Sometimes they are faulty gear. Maybe they are manufactured in small backyard factories. What kind of terrain are they fighting on? They are trenches, rivers, slope, dirt tracks, or steep hill roads. Because these are small militia units which these females are heading. Then you have so basically what happens, the whole conflict situations where women are resorting to violence. Of course, we will come to what are the actual primary reasons why that happens, but I'm just giving a general backdrop. So we have when the stakes become higher, the rebel versus state conflict, and areas are kind of declared hot zones, and rebels sometimes they get little victories, etc. And the way it proceeds, when city appoints peace negotiators, you have certain rebels who are who become turncoats. So there's another aspect which I've talked about is not just the shattered families, but also how conflicts push underground arms and arm trades into very unimagined kind of profits. So there's another business which also starts. The profiteering from the business of war, which also starts happening. So the conflicts never end. They mutate, they change form. So you talk about money, contraband, arms. This is the new currency, and more than the more the violence is, the greater is the profiteering. And sometimes people just don't want the wars to end, the conflicts to end, because so the whole history of violence is built on and the profiteering from that kind of violence, which no one is really interested in stopping. So from hunting, how these female rebels become the hunted. So and taking my characters to the edge of literally being a woman, and especially when it's extreme violence. So, but you sort of how you have to make it all believable and without getting too excessive or graphic. So violence, how it affects men and women, sometimes of course it affects them in different ways, or does it? And also the larger unifying theme which I generally explore is that war is the the war, or the constant war, is actually the biggest business today. And it is in this backdrop where my female rebels, the ones who are choosing violence as a way, or to fight against exploitation, this is where they function. So there's guerrilla warfare where insurgent patrols are hunted down, and by special op combat troops interspersed with a lot of personal tragedies. So I've merged it with a constant war and a female rebel kind of imagery. So this is where I'm coming from. And this is what the kind of content or the kind of stories which I am which I'm writing. One is my book, which is coming this year itself. It's called A History of Violence, and this is the kind of topic which I will be talking about, and hopefully we'll cover all the questions which we have to ask.
Right. Thank you for sharing your insights, ma'am. We will now move on to the Q&A session. My first question is for Professor Atwal. As a professor engaged in gender studies and colonial history, how do you view the shift from perceived innocence to radicalism in women's responses to systematic oppression? And would you say that there are historical patterns or cultural contexts, particularly in colonial or post-colonial India, that makes this transformation more understandable or perhaps inevitable? You are on mute, ma'am.
Sorry. Yeah, now you can hear me. Yeah, that's a long question, but I'll try to answer. So, historically, if we see in as early as 1912 and 1915, in England and in Ireland, the voting rights, women who were agitating for voting rights, which is not aligning with either the nationalistic or socialistic causes which were popular at that time, neither the labor movement. It was only to get voting rights because that was the only mode of empowerment. If they actually flung a stone on a window and it broke, it was called a militant activity. So just flinging a stone at a window of a government building, they were arrested, put in jail. So jail going, therefore, was a strategy at that point of time. You know, you would do little and then you know you'd be arrested, and then you make a point by going to the jail. So that was a kind of a notional understanding of what a movement was. You're part of a systematic movement. However, what happened was in India later on, when women were aligned with the revolutionary movements and cause, they of course had to go underground, and that is where the problem began, because we know very little about what they did underground. We know more about what women did. When they were moving on the constitutional lines, they were actually part of Satyagraha, they were part of 1920s 1920s non-co-op movement, or 1942 Quit India movement. And those are the women we've been, who get all the attention, therefore, because they're very much in their cause aligned. So it is from this that, of course, 1970s was a period. If we look at it historically, it was 1970s when, with the emergence of the Naxal movement, that the women that Richa is talking about, aligned with more violent means against the state. Those kind of women come up, and they're not aligned with either the direct communist cause or freedom, and so they actually, their story becomes more complicated. But one thing that happens in 1970s is the status of women in India reported out, and that shows the inequality between men and women. So their ability to control the narrative is therefore not there. There's no, women are not the agency, they don't have the power to control the narrative. So whether they're villains, whether they're perpetrators of violence, etc., they're subsumed in the overall narrative of, let's say, Naxal or nationalist or socialist. They're not independently doing anything. So this is interesting because this is something we can differentiate. While what Sharmila spoke about was very interesting about the black women, and when we talk about black women's assertion is very different, because they are black. The oppression is based, and their rhetoric and their contestation resistance is based on just the fact that they're denied rights because they're black. you know and also women who are black. So their contestation is very different, and I think somewhere down the line in India, our understanding of caste is not evolved on those lines. That is a pity. It has not. We should have taken caste differences more seriously, and there's so much there. We have this rural and urban divide then, which becomes problematic, which we saw in the case of Nirbhaya, that there was more sympathy for, there was more awareness for Nirbhaya than there was for the than what we saw in the Hathras case. You know, uh, so there is this caste divide, where we can't level women up. We think there are structures which are treating them differently, so it's all right. There's a liberal notion of what a rape is. There is a notion of what a neoliberal notion of what a rape is, how to understand a rapist, etc. Uh, in that sense, I think the, the violence from both sides has to be contextualized. Very recently, we had the case of an online suicide of a man who actually was who was who claimed he was being told to pay an unbelievable amount by the wife, and he didn't have the resources. So we need to very seriously consider these cases of mental violence, which emerge. They are not to be located as simply an issue between husband and wife, or angry women versus more timid men, etc. I think they need to be more systematized, and that is the job of social scientists, literature, and directors at the same time, Richa. That they kind of the screen is a dialogue, where even the audience is having a dialogue with you, with the actors. In that sense, it's not one sided, and you create an imaginatory, which you are right, you want to create a story where everything is actually reproduced. That's why you're bothered about what weaponry, what sets you will use, etc. So it has a very psychological impact on the audience. I think somewhere down the line, historically, we have not proceeded in the same direction. I think we should have been a little bit more radicalized, and we should have moved towards a better understanding of violence, which is missing at present.
Right, right. My next question is for Professor Paul. Throughout literary history, women's narratives often oscillate between archetypes of innocence and rebellion. How do you think literature has shaped and reflected societal perceptions of women who resort to violence, and what role does storytelling play in challenging these perceptions?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier also, that literature for centuries has confined women to archetypes that either idealize their virtue or vilify their defiance. Now, the archetype of innocence embodied by characters like Ophelia in Shakespeare's Hamlet or Lucy Westenra in Bram Stoker's Dracula casts women as and virtuous. So these figures are often defined by their purity and vulnerability, eliciting empathy or serving as moral compasses for male characters. Their narratives are characterized by a lack of agency, as they are acted upon rather than acting themselves. Ophelia's tragic descent into madness and Lucy's victimization in Dracula by Dracula. These underscore their roles as symbols of fragility and moral integrity. In stark contrast to this, the archetype of rebellion defines women who transgress societal norms, often at the cost of their humanity. Characters such as Lady Macbeth, famous in Lady Macbeth in Macbeth. Then there is Medea in Euripides' Medea, and Lisbeth Salander in Stieg Larsson's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. These women are portrayed as dangerous disruptors of order. So their defiance is linked to a rejection of traditional feminine roles, and their actions often invoke fear or condemnation. Lady Macbeth's ruthless ambition and manipulation are framed as quote unquote unnatural, while Medea's violent revenge for betrayal transforms her into tragic anti heroine. So these archetypes emphasize a dichotomy in which women are either paragons of virtue or harbingers of chaos with little room for any nuance. Now, this binary framing becomes even more pronounced when female characters commit acts of violence. Male violence is frequently rationalized as an assertion of power, uh, often of necessity or maybe duty, while female violence is seen as aberrant and in need of justification. Violent women are often depicted as irrational, hysterical, or morally corrupt, and these reflect societal discomfort with female aggression. For example, we can look at media. Media's infanticide is framed as the result of emotional instability and betrayal rather than a calculated act of vengeance. Similarly, Lady Macbeth's eventual descent into madness suggests that her psyche is ill equipped to handle the consequences of her ambition. And this reinforced the notion that violence is incompatible with traditional femininity. These archetype and their narrative framings reflect deeply ingrained in societal attitudes about gender and morality. So, male characters in literature often have the freedom to engage in violence without it defining their entire identity. For example, Hamlet's act of revenge are portrayed as a natural, even noble response to betrayal and injustice. In contrast, women's violence is almost always scrutinized through a lens of morality, mental stability, or victimhood. So, when women commit violence or violent acts, the narrative typically demands an extraordinary justification, such as severe provocation, trauma, or a breakdown of mental health. This double standard has far reaching implications. By reducing violent women to archetypes of innocence, corrupted, or rebellion unhinged, literature reinforces the notion of the female aggression being unnatural, and this must be either explained or excused. Such portrayals deny women the agency to express complex emotions like anger, vengeance, or ambition in ways that are not immediately pathologized or moralized. This framing perpetuates a view of women as inherently nurturing and morally superior, and this actually further limited the scope of their representation. So the consequence of this narrative bias extend beyond literature into societal perceptions. By framing female violence as aberrant, stories reinforce real world stereotypes that women must embody caregiving, self sacrifice, and virtue, even under extreme duress. Conversely, men's violence is more readily accepted, often romanticized as heroic or pragmatic. This dynamic perpetuates unequal standards in how society judges moral and ethical behavior, particularly in contexts like criminal justice, workplace dynamic, or interpersonal relationships. So, in recent years, storytelling has increasingly challenged the archetype of innocence and rebellion. Often, more nuanced portrayals of women and their motivation of violence can be seen. So, modern narratives allow female characters to act violently without reducing them to caricatures of madness or maybe moral corruption. For instance, we have Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl, that presents the protagonist, Amy June, whose manipulations and acts of vengeance are deliberate and calculated. And these challenge readers to grapple with her as a complex anti heroine rather than dismiss her as simply evil or unstable. Similarly, we can refer to Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, that depicts acts of violence by women as acts of rebellion against systemic oppression. So these stories reposition female aggression as a legitimate response to societal injustice rather than a moral failing. They emphasize the structural and contextual forces that drive women to violent actions. These allow audiences to empathize with their choices and see them as agents of their own destinies. Contemporary literature and media have also begun exploring intersectional perspectives, highlighting how factors like race, class, and culture influence the portrayal and reception of violent women. So, in Jasmine Ward's Salvage the Bones, the protagonist, S, violent actions stem from her marginalized position as a poor black teenager. This character navigates an unforgiving environment, and these narratives dismantle the simplistic moral binaries of innocence and rebellion. And they present women as products of their circumstances and choices. So, storytelling at its most powerful fosters empathy, delving into the psychological and social complexities of its characters. Literature that portrays violent women as multidimensional individuals shaped by trauma, oppression, or survival, they challenge societal biases and invite readers to question their assumptions. By presenting female characters whose aggression is rooted in systemic inequality, domestic abuse, or personal betrayal, these narratives compel readers to see beyond the archetypes of victim or villain. Such stories also highlight the structural forces that drive women to violent acts. For instance, systemic oppression, cultural expectations, and personal trauma often leave women with few viable options of asserting their agency. By exploring these forces, literature creates space for broader conversations about gender, power, and justice. And by doing so, it encourages readers to move beyond simplistic judgments and engage with the deeper truths of the human condition.
Right. Moving on to Miss Lakhera. In your novels, characters often grapple with societal pressures and personal betrayals. How do these experiences shape the transition from vulnerability to acts of rebellion or violence in your female protagonist?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sourabhi. Adding, of course, to what Jyoti was just saying, I think Prakash Jha, filmmaker Prakash Jha, said it best when he once said that women heroines, especially in our storytelling, contemporary storytelling, are generally either treated as devis to be worshipped or pets to be cuddled. So, and God forbid if she resorts to violence, and even if it is for a justified cause, she'll have to she'll have a lot of justification to do, and which is really not asked for from a man. So see, as a writer, my job is to show that power struggle also, and there's no denying that roles have changed, but the popular images jo hai abhi bhi, I mean, to define women are still stagnant, and the ideal reader is assumed to be a male, or even the viewer is assumed to be a male. So the female image is designed to delight him or to serve him, and I mean, sadly, even movies, the storytelling in movies also, they have the sorry record of catering to those to that stereotype. The male understanding of a female presence is has been for the longest time either sexualized or servile to them. So our female rebel, of course, the one who's in my stories, is a champ, will be a champion, even if it is a fictional story. She has to be a champion in disturbing that status quo. So essentially, coming back to the stories which I write, now stories happen when life happens and when struggle happens and when the protagonists are vulnerable and the reader hopefully, or the viewer, the watcher, or the one who, if he, either you present the story in a film, or whether you present it as a writer, but whoever is the consumer of the story, hopefully that person is left with the memory of that struggle. I think a female protagonist choosing violence, excessive violence, is not as we all know, the traditional template of female heroes. I mean, that has vastly been seen, as Jyoti also mentioned before this, it's vastly been seen as a domain of the male hero. I will go as far as to say that the popular female protagonist's journey has largely been that of either a temptress whose main goal has been to kind of distract the male hero from his goal, or she's used as a catalyst to help him achieve his goal. So, having said that, rebellion we know is nothing to do with gender. In that sense, rebellion is gender agnostic. There is no separate uniform of a female rebel or a male rebel, people who resort to violence. That said, female protagonists, of course, the way our society is constructed, perhaps have to navigate far more social psychological, physiological fault lines than the male counterpart. That goes without saying. The journey of the female rebel, I think, in my stories, follow the classic Joseph Campbell template, which is actually there for the male hero also, the male rebel also. Uh, Simply put, she faces trauma and initially, and then her journey is when it starts. When the hero, the heroine, or the hero, the rebel hero, she faces trauma, and there's this call to adventure, and then there is whole rites of passage and faces ordeals. She makes enemies, forms allies, and there are those all is lost moments and heroic move, and then you have your resolution, which is the classic Joseph Campbell template. I don't deviate much from that. Uh, so whether it is contamination, whether it is my forthcoming A History of Violence, or whether it was Hungry Gods, the rebel, my rebel, I mean, she is initially a reluctant hero. She gets frustrated, faces trauma, often fails, doesn't get allies very easily. She's seen as a misfit. The initial traumatic events essentially is the call which necessitates action. And she faces the trials, obviously, of operating in a male dominated zone. And what sets her apart is that she's not afraid of challenging the status quo repeatedly. Despite how or what the society calls her or how she's looked at, she's not very invested in the external gaze. How people are looking at her, she's not interested or invested in that. It remains whether, and actually, rebellion can happen, of course, in any space. It can happen in a formal office space, or she can be rebelling against norms. And if it is a woman combat leading a group of males in war, which is in my books, either there she's rebelling or whether she's at home rebelling against stereotypes or rebelling against her own people, or if she's rebelling against an established social or moral or legal or sexual order or things as it were. And God forbid if she resorts to violence. The female rebel in general popular literature is generally presented as a kind of dragon lady. It's like, it's also, I think, pinned to this idea that the rebellious woman there is some kind of threat in her. Like as Jyoti also mentioned before this, that the male hero, when a male rebels or when there's violence associated with the male, you don't really see that as a threat. It's seen as a heroic thing. But when it is pinned or when it is associated with a rebellious woman, she's seen like a dragon lady, and they see it is kind of pinned to some kind of an inherent threat in her, and she's somehow waiting to be tamed, by some man. And on top of it, if she has resorted to violence, then and excessive violence, then one can imagine the earthquake in social order. It will unleash. कि भाई कैसी औरत है. So there are always those men who will think less of her, and there is no reason for any man or the society even to make allowances to help a female hero or a female rebel to succeed. I mean, she'll have to make her own path. So if she had, the point is, but that if she had refused to take up that challenge, see, it's her choice. So if she refuses to take up that challenge, then her experience, I think, would be that of a victim and not a rebel, not a hero. Right. So rebellion is about, I think, making such choices, tough choices, choices which don't make you very popular. And the plot in the story, which I write, the plot will be such that it will provoke my hero, my female hero, to make such choices. And her choices will reveal her integrity. You see, so of course we can't deny that there are always active challenges to female power presences. I mean, female power presence. And female rebellion at every level. But what I do avoid in my storytelling is that I avoid explaining my protagonist's choice every time from a gender point of view. I think that kind of flattens the storytelling. Story of the becoming of a rebel, I think, also is when she starts making unsafe choices. And rebelling is quite a lot to do with making those uncomfortable, often dangerous choices. And rebellion is also about doing what you think is right, even if it is going against your loved ones. And rebellion is also demanding a seat at the table. Sometimes you get your own seat to the table. Rebellion is only, it requires courage because no one is going to give it to you. Remember, like, no one wants to disturb the status quo. And our female rebel, whether she chooses violence, whether she doesn't choose violence, but she's a female rebel, and she's a champion at disturbing that status quo. So, yeah, this is what I have to say here. Sourabhi.
Right. Moving on to Professor Atwal, the concept of the ideal Hindu widow evolved into a metaphor for a recovering nation in the anti-colonial struggle. Your book, Real and Imagined Widows, talks about the struggles of these women. How did this transformation influence women's roles in resistance movements, and do you think that it contributed to their justification of adoption of violence in certain contexts?
Yeah, thank you, Sourabhi. In fact, instead of engaging with my book, I think I'd like to engage with what Richa has said. Just said. It is very interesting that what is an acceptable digression, what is acceptable and what is not. How are the women deciding their own limits? How is this negotiation possible? Is it even possible? Can she decide? That's the other thing. I think here we should hold up an example of a unique case of Mother India, where violence was accepted. Not only accepted, it was hailed. It was exaggerated. It was one of the best-selling movies. It went in for Oscars in 50s. So, something we were imagining. A very ideal woman, very ideal woman who can actually uh, who can actually live up to the idea of honor. And this idea of honor is basically the idea that has been created in the space of village, by at the village level, by the Gandhian notion. And this honor from the village has to be kept up. So this woman is, therefore, in this particular case, the main heroine, she kills her own son in the end. And uh, there is nobody has ever objected to that. That how can you can anybody just kill one's own son? I mean, it would be a very it would be a very unacceptable thing. But in this case, because the movie represented her struggle, it embodied her struggle, she became an embodiment of so many things. And this is what I've done in my book. Also, coming to my book, I have a chapter on Mother India there for similar reason, that I was looking at widows, as to how widows, outside the domestic space, they were having to face different circumstances, challenges of remarriage, challenges of also being exploited, economically bankrupt, etc. So these are the women who don't fall under any law making, because law was being made for only those who are within the family, to protect them. Widow remarriage, as Sati Act was passed in the early 19th century. Later on, age of consent also came up in that sense, but there was really very little that was left for the widows, except for the property rights, which was, of course, not acceptable till 1937. No property right was really acceptable. And it is only after that, in the 50s, that we have this notion that, yes, under the Hindu law, it is permissible, maintenance is permissible, yet the rights have been very hard won. But at the same time, how does this violence get accepted? That is one thing. uh, I think there was a process of sedimentization over a period of time over women's bodies in the colonial period, which made them, which make them like a devi, which actually imparted some kind of holiness, sacredness into the women. And out of these this idea, where I think this is where Coral's work is also very important, that how the sacred women are actually entering the notion of the secular. They become mascots for nationalism, you know and they so this violence therefore is accepted because it is in keeping with the idea of Gandhian notion of honor. That is what the anti-colonial movement does, creates this new kind of acceptable violence. That's what I just wanted to add to that. I've really nothing more to say. I think all points have been very well covered by Sharmila and Richa.
Right. Okay, ma'am. Um, Moving on to Professor Paul. In historical narratives, especially those prepared by men, there are instances of women resorting to radical measures for survival and self respect. They are conveniently, however, categorized as criminals, antisocial, and such like without necessarily studying the backstories that made them. Did the translation of such narratives across languages, cultures, or media attempt to explain with deeper research or inclusive studies?
Yeah, so as you have mentioned, that the historical portrayal of women who resorted to radical measures for their survival and self-respect, these narratives are often shaped by the biases of predominantly male historians. The portrayals typically label such women as criminals, antisocial, or defiants, as you've said. But they hardly contextualize their actions within the oppressive systems that constrain their choices. So, this moralistic framing, what it does is it erases the agency of these women, and they simplify their complex lives into cautionary tales or outright vilification. So the lack of empathy in these accounts reflect broader societal attitudes that stigmatized women who defied patriarchal norms, and this happens especially to the stories related to submission, morality, and domesticity. So, for example, we can give examples of figures like Joan of Arc or Anne Bonny. I have already talked about Joan of Arc. Anne Bonny, on the other hand, is a pirate who was living during the early 18th century, and she was labeled as a criminal and immoral figure by, again, male chroniclers. And these male chroniclers, they ignored or downplayed the economic, social, and gendered constraints that might have led her to piracy as a means of autonomy and survival. So, in addition to this, I would like to say that translation and most importantly, reinterpretation across languages, not only languages, cultures, or media, they have sometimes sought to challenge these reductive views. In literature, like Antigone from Greek tragedy, they have been reinterpreted countless times as a feminist icon who defied unjust laws for moral principles. This contrasts with her portrayal in certain ancient accounts that framed her as obstinate and sometimes a threat to societal order. Similarly, in media, Jiang Yisao, that is a Chinese pirate leader of the 19th century. She has been portrayed as either a ruthless criminal or a resourceful strategist um, who built a maritime empire despite systemic barriers. So, with reference to these translations and reinterpretations, we can say that they highlight how intention and context shape such women and how then they are perceived by the society at large. So, the medium of reinterpretation also plays a crucial role. Films such as Thelma and Louise or Queen and Slim reimagine women resorting to crime as acts of resistance against systemic oppression. And they turn societal judgment into a lens for critique. So, academic analysis such as these in feminist historiography, they further deconstruct these narratives by examining the patriarchal and cultural frameworks that vilified these women. However, not all reinterpretations succeed in challenging biases. For example, popular media often sensationalizes such figures, reducing them to caricatures or quote unquote dangerous women, or sometimes as tragic figures also. Thus, they perpetuate the original stereotype. And to counter this, reinterpretations must approach these narratives with a nuanced understanding of the socio-political forces at play and a commitment to foreground the women's agency and context. Uh, so this is something which often is lacking, especially in male reinterpreters or translators, while dealing with the cases of women. Is most importantly, women rebel. Ultimately, one can say that the portrayal of women who defied societal norms for survival or self respect, they serve as a mirror reflecting these cultural attitudes only towards gender and power. And these narratives remain fertile ground for challenging historical biases and reimagining complex female agency in the face of oppression. So that's what I can say about this.
Right, thank you. Moving on to Miss Lakhera. Crime and moral ambiguity are central to your stories. What role do you think internal conflicts play in pursuing women from a state of perceived innocence to becoming agents of violence or disruption?
Yeah, thanks, Sourabhi, for the question. I'll answer that, but before that, can I just make one statement? I feel women all have always been or are too much invested in what the society thinks of them, or the male gaze or the external gaze. So I have grappled with, when I write my characters or when we try to build a character, then what I find is I grapple with this question whether my female hero's journey, my female protagonist's journey as a hero, I mean, it is destined to conflict with her psychological, with her physiological destiny as a female. I i would say the conflict is to the extent she lets it. you know See, essentially, when you come to a motivation of, for a motivation to kind of commit violence or to rebel, primal urge hoti hai, the primal urge which pushes a female protagonist to rebel or resort to violence, is it very different from a male's motivation, a desire to save one's family, save your children, desire to protect one's land, desire to find a mate, desire to get revenge, desire for survival. Men and women, they feel the same thing. So this core jo motivation, the motivation, it resonates at a caveman level. That is there in a male rebel and a female rebel both. So the female rebel must have, these are basic bonds, these are primal urges. And I think also the reader or the viewer, they kind of identify with that. So that needs to be authentic. Basically, that part needs to be authentic. I mean, we can't make that up. Survival, hunger, protection of a loved one, self-respect, revenge, So we have to give, I have to give my character, I give my character, the female protagonist, the rebel, I give her real stakes, very primal stakes, stakes that are very basic, that even everyone understands, and the society understands at a very primal level. So because, I think, and I feel that people, we all respond very best to stories of families, husbands, wives, people in our lives. When you say father, I see my father. When you say child, I see my child. So our rebel also wants something real and simple. It's nothing esoteric. So my point, perfect female rebel kya hai? A perfect female rebel, according in my stories, is the one who offers or who faces the most conflict in her journey. She has the longest emotional journey and has a primal goal we can all root for. I make her journey as difficult as possible. You see, so but the primal goal jo hoga wo hoga, everyone can root for it. So heroism and rebellion, at the end of the day, of course, it's about making choices. The plot needs to force her to make those choices and force her to face her biggest fear. Right. I don't think that's really different between man and woman. I don't, because I believe that flattens my storytelling if I keep thinking of her as a woman or as a man. I've never thought like that. So that's how I treat my female protagonists, as I will treat my male protagonists. Of course, there will be certain challenges she will face in the plot, maybe more as a female, but that will not define my whole storytelling. But and what I will see, of course, she will be forced to face odds, and which will transform her externally, internally. And as I said, the complete Joseph Campbell arc, and I also think that the journey of my female rebel or my female protagonist or our female hero is also look at the human condition, not just a female condition. So, so it has to be a look at the human condition, and it has to be rooted in very authentic, relatable emotions. And so, I think the rebel female is a champion at becoming, at changing, And the overall theme in my stories is always choosing, light over darkness. Of course, that's there. She's a hero. She has to choose light over darkness. She has to choose those. And the plot is such that which forces her to provokes her to make choices. And it also talks about the transformative power of forgiveness. The larger issues which matter, forgiveness and integrity, and and of course the fact that if she had refused to take the call, then she would be a victim. And I'm not interested in victims. I don't write about victims. You have to make heroic choices to find space in storytelling. So as a rebellious female protagonist resorting to violence, I think it also comes down to the kind of hero you want to project, or I want to project, or I want to talk about, or I'm interested in, right? I will, and it comes to the morality question also. So I think that the modern hero, the female rebel, is a mix of contemporary morality and contemporary aspiration also, which has changed. It is not the same as it was 10, 20 years ago. It's completely changed now. So I think there is a big problem which writers face today. You see, because we are not writing for a small ecosystem, we are writing for also for public consumption. And so I feel that there is this problem which we face as writers. Ki what kind of woman should be today's rebel hero? Kis tarah ki aurat? Right? How do we show that? What do we say? So writers की problem है कैसी औरत या कैसा आदमी hero बने. तो ये this confusion I think is also an extension of the confusion in society. Why? Because ये confusion इसलिए भी है because even in society, what is wrong and what is right, क्या गलत है क्या सही है, has changed over a period of time. Because if the society can't decide what is right, what is wrong, then our big definitive rebels just cannot come into existence. Like for instance, in storytelling in films, अब देखिए जैसे 10 साल पहले 10 years back, rich people were bad. Seth ji, the Seths, Zamindar, they were bad. And poor were good in our stories, right? Today, everyone wants to be करोड़पति. So सबके दिमाग में यही सवाल है कि कौन बनेगा, है ना, करोड़पति. So it's not a bad thing. Wealth is now not a bad thing. So we can't show that the rich in bad light. We want to be rich ourselves. So अब हम अमीरों को बुरा नहीं दिखा सकते, हम खुद अमीर बनना चाहते हैं, तो गरीब तो हमारा हीरो या हीरोइन जो भी हमारा फीमेल हीरो है, मेल हीरो, गरीब दिखना चाहते, वो नहीं दिखना चाहता, so the hero we cannot just show him as a poor guy because that is not the aspiration of today's society. So ना आपका हीरो जेल जाना चाहता है, ना आपका हीरो सरकार के खिलाफ बोलता है, तो हम बुरा किसको कहें? So I think as writers we feel restricted, and I think that's a type test today for writers also कि आप क्या किरदार, क्या कैरेक्टर पेश करना चाहते हैं, as a so what kind of character will your female lead be, or what is she rebelling against? So I think, but at the end of the day, it is always about making choices and which take you out of your comfort zone. Yeah, that's all I have to say here.
Right, thank you. So this brings us to the end of today's session. I would like to thank all the panelists once again for sharing their invaluable perspectives and for taking out time from your busy schedules to join us this evening. I would also like to remind your viewers once again that we are calling for submissions for the project. Please visit www.tellmeyourstory.biz for further details. We'll come back to you soon again with our next panel discussion. Till then, goodbye and good night.
Okay,
Thank
bye.
you. Thank you, Sourabhi,
Bye.
Jyoti, and
Bye.
Sharmila.
Thank you. Oh, so we are finally done with it.